Yeah, please. Could you identify yourself when you speak?
Yeah. Hi. My name is Sophia. I'm a law student at McGill. I've seen several of your videos and your discussions with various people like Dave Rubin and Sam Harris and Bill Warner and people like that. And you have, I don't want to mischaracterize you, but you have called yourself an atheist or a secular Jew. And I'm wondering, how much do you think the role that religion as Jews or Christians plays in combating another religion that is much more violent, and whether or not the secularization of our society has contributed to our being weak to these outside influences and outside forces from radical and not so radical Islam.
So pragmatically, I think you're exactly correct that if you have another religion that people hold very dear to their hearts, then it makes it more difficult for a supremacist religion to fill the vacuum, so to speak.
Right.
And that's exactly what Ayaan Hirsi Ali had argued a few years ago when she was arguing that, hey, try to get Muslims, if they still wish to be monotheistic, if they still wish to somehow connect to their Abrahamic religious roots, have them switch to Christianity because it will somehow fill a religiosity void. I'm not sure that that's workable. So pragmatically, I get your point. But my thinking, and maybe I'm being suboptimal and not being pragmatic enough, in my view, believing in one set of fairy tales or another ultimately is not a good idea.
Well, it's a set of values. I mean, the set of values that those fairy tales impart on us are not. They're foundational to our Western civilization. So, I mean, whether or not we believe that Moses actually hit the rock and water spurted out, or that he actually got, I mean, the values that we get from those stories.
Yes and no, right? Because I could also point to endless moral edicts in the books that come from my religion that I wouldn't necessarily subscribe to. So in other words, here we are succumbing to the unicornia stuff, right? Where there is 10 different moral edicts. The 5 that I don't like, I somehow ignore, but the 5 that I like, geez, thank God that I know that the celestial dictator is teaching me this, because otherwise I would be decapitating puppies and raping them. The reality is that I view, and I don't want to get into this too much, but I view that, and none other than Charles Darwin has argued this, so who am I to say otherwise? But in the exact same way that you could argue evolutionarily why we have opposable thumbs, there are very, very easy arguments to be made for how we've evolved our moral compass. And there are endless scientists who've made that argument. So we don't necessarily need to refer to religion to argue for where our moral sense comes from. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I got 2 questions. One, I'm curious to know if this syndrome, this ostrich syndrome, if you found evidence of it on the right side of the political spectrum, because if you only find it only on one side, that begins to cast some doubt on your scientific objectivity, since gravity makes everything fall, not just stuff you don't want.
Right.
And the other part of that is there are lots of good reasons why people tread very softly when speaking critically about Muslims. One of them is simply there are a lot of them, and it doesn't make a lot of good sense to antagonize 3 to 4 billion people. So
that number is a bit off, but...
Sorry?
1.4.
Yeah. Fine, I'll take 1.2.
Yeah. I inhabit an ecosystem called academia. Within that ecosystem, most of the people that navigate within that world happen to be of a particular political persuasion. Therefore, because I often get from fans and detractors where they say, why do you spend so much time attacking people on the left? I do that not because that demonstrates that I'm somebody on the right. That's because most of the people, it turns out, who are proponents of many of these positions happen to be academics. And to the extent that most academics, and certainly the vociferous ones, are ones who happen to be of a particular political persuasion, they're the ones who I'm going to critique. that doesn't say anything about what my political persuasion is. It simply says that that's the reality. I'll give you an example. There have been studies that have looked at, and I actually had the guy who's done this work on my show. His name is Dan Klein, an economist. He's looked at the political persuasion of academics across many disciplines. It's breathtaking. So across disciplines, it's 5-to-1 ratio, meaning this is in the US, 5 Democrats to 1 Republican. Now already that's extraordinary. So for example, if you know anything in medicine, if you say that something goes from being, if you have a 1.2 chance of getting a disease, 20% more, that's a very powerful effect. 5-to-1 is unheard of, right? So in specific fields where there's a lot of political activism, it goes up to, anybody can guess what the ratio is? 44-to-1. Okay? So for example, if you are a student who is studying sociology, the ratio of professors in terms of their political persuasion is 44-to-1. So then who do you want me to go after? The unicorn Republican who only exists in the deep recesses of your mind? He doesn't exist on campus. Or he exists, but he's too afraid to open his mouth.
But I'm not so worried about the academics. Luckily, they're a feckless lot in these
No,
cases.
they have a lot of power.
I'm worried about the politicians. I'm worried about the public intellectuals out there on both sides of the political spectrum.
Well, I think the problem is that it's a confluence of the perfect storm. Everyone who is the dispenser of information happens to be of one political persuasion. If you turn to your celebrities for information, they're going to be leftist. If you go to academia, they're going to be leftist. If you go to the media and journalism, they're going to be leftist. So there's nowhere where I can turn, where I can get an alternate viewpoint. And as I've explained to people when they say, well, of course academics are going to be democratic, they're intelligent. I find that bafflingly stupid, right? When it comes to certain scientific facts, it's clear, right? I mean, evolution is not a Zionist hoax, it's real. But when it comes to fiscal policy, or whether you're for or against the death penalty, or whether you're for or against affirmative action, people who are very reasonable could be on either side of this issue. And if you are a student, you'd like to think that you should be exposed to these multiplicity of views. But regrettably, you're not. And so you should be worried about that.
Let's take the example of climate change, right?
Yes.
I would say you could do a very nice numeric diagram indicating that it exists. Yet there are a lot of people who, in spite of all the facts, and these do tend to be on the right,
And
they deny it.
And I'll be the first to then say they're also suffering from OPS.
Okay, fine, that's
Yeah.
what I was asking.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I'll give you another example. Let's say in my scientific work, let me give you, today I was focusing, because of the nature of this crowd, on Islam and OPS. But I could talk about, for example, the abdication of biology by social scientists as a manifestation of OPS. So in my scientific career, I've spent 20 plus years trying to argue the profoundly heretical position that humans are biological beings. To most social scientists, this turns out to be a profoundly heretical position. To most social scientists, cultural anthropologists and sociologists and women's studies and all the other bullshitters, no disrespect to anybody who is in women's studies, my apologies. And by the way, women's...
What about sociology?
There are some very serious sociologists, and then there are some not so serious ones. So for example, if you are somebody who studies sociometrics, you're applying the very serious tools of science to study sociological phenomena, you're a serious scientist. If you are a political activist who is masquerading as a sociologist, then I have a problem with you, right? And so when it comes to my scientific field, I've spent much of my career trying to fight OPS and trying to convince people that, hey, if you want to understand consumer behavior, you can understand consumer behavior without recognizing that consumers are shaped by biological forces. Well, I think that anybody in this room would say, well, yeah, no kidding. I mean, what else could it be? Well, to most social scientists, that's heretical. Why? Because they argue that what makes us human is that we transcend our biology. Evolution applies to the mosquito. Evolution applies to the zebra. Evolution doesn't apply to the humans. That's what makes us human. So yes, OPS does not need to be on the left alone. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
So let's say do an experiment, and you have a foolproof antidote to OPS. You are able to spread it virally through the drinking water, and everyone is cured of this virus, and we're all back to normal, thinking rationally, and we now see the problem as clear as day. And what do you think the political and social ramifications of that would be to, I mean, the religion X of peace?
You're talking
In our
about
society.
Jainism. Let's be.
Yes.
Unitarianism.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, bigotry.
Look, first step. Well, I guess you've passed the first step because you said that everybody's
Yeah,
now been
we're
cured.
good now.
We're good now. Okay. Then in that case, do not. It's point number 4. Do not cede an inch to. So if we agree that well, then that's it. That's
Yeah,
in other words.
but no,
There's,
the next step is there's going to be an actual social phenomenon that
Right.
occurs because people will start to react
so
in ways that they don't react now.
So I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, but let me see if
To stop immigration of Muslims in other words.
well,
Hardly.
so let me answer that not quite in this way. I had Andrew McCarthy on my show. Andrew McCarthy is a former federal prosecutor who was, I think he was the lead prosecutor on the first 9/11 case. So not the 2001,
Right, the
but
blind
the
sheep.
right, the blind check, exactly.
Blind sheep.
The Trade Center, the 1993 one, right? And he's a lawyer, and so toward the end of our conversation, and I would invite you to all listen to it, I asked him whether he could conceive of a day where a religious ideology could be construed as seditious, and his answer, in slightly caressing way, yes. So that answers your question. So anybody is welcome to come into my house. You're all welcome, my brothers, whether you're purple, green, tall, short, fat, thin, as long as you adhere 100% to our values. 1 nano inch of transgression from that, and you go back to where you came from. You're not
that's
welcome
what-
here.
So basically, that's what you're saying, is that once the disease is passed and everyone is woken up from this ostrich syndrome, the result won't only be a reluctance to let anyone with those values in, but there will be a direct and vociferous and physical reaction against those people who are already here. And what I'm suggesting as a result is that part of this OPS is a self-protection by the authorities especially.
But it's
to
not
prevent
protected.
mass
You're just
social unrest.
you're kicking the can down the line.
Well, I-
You could either solve the problem. Look, I come from Lebanon.
No, I understand.
It's
I'm trying
the
to get you-
it's the definition of butchery.
Yeah.
The butchery that you see today, I saw it as a child,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you could either solve the problem the way we are today, peacefully, rationally, politely with one another, or we could solve it tomorrow in much more violent ways.
Right.
The problem is going to be confronted. It's now our decision to decide what mode of persuasion we use. So what I'm arguing is we still have the time to solve this problem peacefully. There will be a day when good men and women of conscience will wake up and say, I've had enough, and I'm now going to implement policies that are a lot more nasty than anything that I would want to see.
That's already begun.
But how come they haven't in Europe reached that I've had enough? And they've had plenty.
They slowly are, right? The rise of the far right, I put it in quotes because some of the things that some of these guys are saying are hardly far right, but anything that is contrary to the current narrative somehow becomes Nazi. Those parties are starting to rise. So I think we're starting to see a bit of that, don't you think?
Well, except that you would, like, for example, in Sweden, you're not, they have this thing, corridor of opinion, where you're not allowed
Sweden
to actually...
is patient zero of OPS. OPS started, that's where it proliferates from. So Sweden is gone. Say goodbye to Sweden. We're done.
Question over here. Stand up, yes, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
It's certainly important to see how hatred is manifested. But it still leaves us with 2 other problems. First, what causes hatred to begin with? Because you'll always find some ways of rationalizing the hate, and if you don't deal with what causes it, it keeps recurring in different disguises, so that you can add umpteen more ways of people being fooled. And then the second case is, particularly now, there seems to be a problem or a disease, as you would call it, among so-called liberal people who are let themselves be misled. So why is that happening? In other words, these are two important manifestations in dealing with the problem.
So let me address the first one first. I draw an analogy from my consumer psychology work. So for example, so when a company is trying to target children for advertising, there are legal, ethical, and moral codes that say, you know, it's inappropriate for you to try to sell an 8-year-old child chewing gum. And I'm going to get to your question in a second. And the reason why you argue that is because to try to persuade an 8-year-old child is viewed as grotesque because that child doesn't have the cognitive apparatus to build defenses against your persuasive message. Okay? Now, on the one hand, we don't allow companies to target children to sell them chewing gum because they're very impressionable. But on the other hand, straight out of the womb, you could teach a child to hate a group because your God wants you to hate them. What do you think the downstream effect of that's going to be? So to answer your question of where does hate come from, if I take a child from age 0 and I inculcate him over and over and over with a selling message, the selling message is hate group X because they're the enemies of God, blah, 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 what do you think the outcome is going to be? Then you're going to get 99% of people from that society.
So how do you stop it then? And the other
My
thing
going
is,
like this should
and the
answer it
other
for you.
thing is also to get to the second question. What seems to be particularly bad today is the fact of how so-called good people are misled into believing all kinds of myths. So how do you demystify those people?
So to answer, so that kind of gets to this part, which is, what are the forces that have led to its spread? Which speaks to your second point. How come liberal people are?
Right.
So there's a cocktail of things which will probably take too long for us to cover here. But let me give you just one manifestation. If you buy into the idea of cultural relativism, right, then that already sets the fertile ground for you to be infected by OPS, right? If you think that it is gauche to ever criticize the cultural / religious practices of the other, irrespective of how grotesque those practices are, as per hair boy Justin Trudeau, who, if you remember very clearly when he was not prime minister, when he was a parliamentarian, wasn't upset by some of the practices coming from those lands, but was upset by the gentleman who used the word barbaric. Where does that come from? Where did that reflex come from? It came from him having been parasitized through OPS, specifically with cultural relativism. It is wrong for us to criticize the behaviors of the other. We are othering them. So that's one way by which the OPS infiltrates itself into your brain. And so what my next book is going to be is exactly answering that second question of yours. What leads to people being susceptible to being parasitized by this stupidity? Yes, sir.
So one thing that you've written in your slide is about winning the battle of ideas, which is something I've heard other intellectuals say, like Sam Harris or Dave Rubin, and it's something that I vehemently agree with. But being a young person in school, I find that the problem that we have now is engagement, because you just can't engage with certain people about anything, right? And the question I have is exactly how do you engage with these people that don't even want to have a conversation at all? I mean, you've seen this with the Jordan Peterson fiasco,
Sure.
for example, where it's just a complete straw man because they're not willing to even talk. So, I mean, it's one thing to talk about winning the battle of ideas, but how exactly do you even go about doing that when the other side won't even engage?
Right.
That's the
So
problem.
last month I gave a talk at the Manning Conference in Ottawa on restriction of freedom and freedom of speech on campuses. And my lecture basically was very simple. I took out of the endless emails that I received from people, from professors, from students, from parents of students, where they are offering me first-person testimonies of the difficulties that they're facing. I just read a bunch of those. And if you closed your eyes and didn't know that I was reading testimonies from people in Canada and the US and in a few cases in Europe, you would think it's North Korea. I mean, literally, I mean, you should just go and read those, see my
I've
Tesla.
experienced a lot of that. like,
Exactly.
just-
So
yeah.
what needs to happen is the zeitgeist has to change. I mean, there's no sort of magic pill, but in the exact same way that I, along with many others, called Alicia Keys on her stupidity yesterday with that tweet, causing her to retreat, right? That was a very small battle. But I decided that I can't put up with that grotesque position. I stopped anything else that I was doing, and I put out a sad truth clip. And so did he, and so did he, and so did he. So if you went to her Twitter thread, you see the tsunami of blowback she got. She runs away. So do this every day in every exchange. Don't cower, right? Politely, respectfully. Don't call names, don't spread hate, but engage, don't retreat. And do that on Facebook and on Twitter and in your classroom and at the bar, and then eventually that's the battle of ideas. There's no other way to do it. There's no magic recipe.
Right.
Yes, sir. In the back, the last row.
I just like to say I'm a big fan of yours.
Speak up, please, can't
Thank
hear
you.
you.
Yeah. My name's Oliver from Concordia.
Hi.
I'm a big fan, and I heard about your Freedom Summit that you're still planning. I hope you're still planning.
Right. I could give you a quick.
Yeah, just as a prelude. That'd be
Sure.
nice.
So I'll go public with it now. As I expected, I have faced institutional roadblocks with trying to set up a freedom summit at a Western university to speak about freedom of speech. I won't get into all the issues right now, but it's been slightly railroaded. I'm trying to see whether it is feasible to still hold it at Concordia or whether I'll just hold it at a separate venue.
When is it?
I was hoping to have it actually this spring. So what I was hoping to do is to invite largely academics who are fighting the battle of freedom in different ways. So Jordan Peterson with his gender pronoun stuff, myself with whatever I do, somebody else with other. So it's not about Islam, it's about, you know, people who are, the very few academics who are willing to have the testicular fortitude to actually fight against this thing.
And actually, my
Yeah.
other question I wanted to
Yeah,
ask
okay.
is about your views, a bit contrasting with Jordan Peterson's in a way, because as I could tell by your presentation today and many of your other videos, you view Islamic hegemony as one of the biggest problems, or if not the biggest problem facing the West at this moment, whereas Peterson is more on the side of tribalism and loss of the logos. So I was wondering if you could maybe establish parallels from those two concepts today, or just simply answer the question, what is the biggest threat to the West? Is it Islamic hegemony or loss of the logos via tribalism and lack of discourse?
Well, Islamic supremacism is one manifestation of tribalism, right? It's tribalism on steroids, right? So they're not really different things. From my understanding of Jordan, who's become a good friend, although I haven't really delved into his sort of positions on religion, I asked him straight out, actually in Ottawa when we met last month, whether he was a religious person, and he said that he was. And I'd like to perhaps explore that further in the next chat we'll be having, which will be soon on my channel. So I can't speak very intelligently to some of his religious positions because I don't know them well enough. And so I would rather hold off rather than say something that is not grounded in good sense. Yes. Yes.
Ian Down, I'm with the Concordia Student News. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on some of the anti-Islamist groups that have sprung up right here in Quebec. For example, La Meute, or the Soldiers of Odin. Whether or not you agree with them or sympathize with them, or what your feelings are on them.
I don't know this group at all. The only organization that I'm aware of that has a implicit, if not explicit, anti-Islam agenda is Point de Bascule. That's the only group that I'm aware of. Point de Bascule is a French translation of tipping point. And the director of that group is someone that I know. But that's the only group that I'm aware of, so I can't really comment on it.
Hi, Dr. Saad. My name is Gustavo, I'm a bike messenger. Just in regards to combating OPS among specifically moderate proponents of Islam, how would one differentiate between the practice of taqiyya, which would be conscious deception, and the unconscious suffering of OPS?
Right. I think, frankly, most of the people, maybe here I'm going to be charitable and optimistic, I think a lot of people who, certainly a lot of Muslims who will appear as though they're suffering from OPS, it's simply because they actually don't know what's in their texts. Very much like very few of us here who are Jewish will be able to very clearly tell you what's in Deuteronomy. I mean, we're Jewish in that we're born into a particular, tradition, and we identify perhaps culturally. So many people are culturally Islamic. They have ties to their roots. But if you tell them what does that particular passage in the Quran say, they couldn't tell you. So I'd like to think, maybe I'm being too optimistic, that in most cases, when people genuinely think that there aren't such passages, they're not engaging in taqiyya, but rather they're ignorant of the truth.
Okay.
Because the reality is their mother and father and brother and everybody that they've ever met have all been Muslim, and they've all been lovely, and they've never preached violence. And so what are you going to believe? Your daily life, or you're meeting people who are perfectly peaceful, or are you going to believe? And so that's what ends up happening.
Okay. So just give the benefit of the doubt.
I mean, I'm being charitable. I couldn't tell you what is the frequency of each type, but I'd like to think that most of them are arguing from a position of ignorance rather than from a position of deception.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Thierry person. In your personal experience, anyone who I guess you'd categorize as being afflicted with OPS, have you ever been able to bring them back to sanity, or at least
Yes.
inch them back? I mean, is it a futile conversation to have?
It's not. It's not. As a matter of fact, I receive many emails from people who say, you've completely changed my view. I started off at position X, I've been consuming all yours, but it's brutal, it's fatiguing, it's exhausting. I remember recently I put up a clip and a person noted, Dr. Saad looks very tired. I said, wow, what an astute, because I generally was because it's a daily tsunami of bullshit that you receive. And unless you are willing to, and I have a busy life as a professor. This is not the only thing I do, fighting OPS sufferers, right? But I do it because I have the forum that allows me to do it. Plus, my personhood is such that I wouldn't be able to go to sleep at night thinking that I could have contributed whatever small voice I have to the discussion and not having done so. And that's actually one of the things that upsets me the most about my colleagues, which is I find it frankly baffling that none of them ever weigh in any way publicly to anything I ever say, right? If, for example, I post, and some of you might have seen me mention this example before, if I post something on my Facebook page about some hick Republican who was an evolution denier, oh boy, watch the likes happen. Because that's progressive. That's what you're supposed to do if you're sipping lattes in your progressive club. But if I post something about horrifying female genitalia, nothing. Nothing. I can't compel you to even like it. I can't compel you to even be minimally moved. No. So cowardice is the greatest enemy. Take cowardice, put OPS, put them together, you have the perfect storm. Yes. Yes, sir.
Just one point. Have you encountered or addressed secularism as a religion? That is to say, when humanism is extended into a claim for moral equality of mankind, and therefore you don't criticize Islam, you don't criticize the other, because you're asserting humanistic values, and you hope they will come around to your position.
Have I interacted with anybody who holds those views?
Do you find yourself addressing this?
Not so much. I mean, in the manner in which I use the word secularism is simply the idea that there should be a separation between church and state, right? There shouldn't be mandated breaks for prayers in a public class. And that's the extent to which I use the term secularism. But that kind of speaks to her question too, which is by having a strong bent on secularism and on atheism and on moving away from religiosity, there's a vacuum that comes about that is now being filled by a group of folks who are very committed to their religion. Whether it be violently so or not, or very peacefully and with just piety. And so that isn't a problem, and I'm not sure how to solve it.
I just want to
Sure.
say that there could be a piety of humanistic values which leads precisely to the kind of
OPS.
that you're describing. It's a refusal to think.
So, but how would humanism, how would the ethos of humanism result in OPS? For example, with cultural relativism, I demonstrated how, right? If you believe that it is gauche to art to criticize other cultures, then you're likely to succumb to OPS. How would humanism result in a greater incidence of OPS?
By valuing all individual experiences in some sense equal, we must respond to all of it in a similar way.
So I would use a different ideology there rather than humanism. And that, again, speaks to the book that I'm writing. That's postmodernism, right? So what postmodernism does is it says that there is no absolute universal truth, there is no objective reality.
Cultural relativism.
It's all part of that same, melange of nonsense. So I would argue it's postmodernism rather than humanism. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Dimitri. I'm 22 years old. What do you? Sorry. What do you look?
I have socks older than you.
Too much information.
Sorry. So, what do you look to as motivation to curing people of OPS? Especially when you're feeling that fatigue of always arguing with these people that refuse to engage you.
Thank you for that question. A dogged desire to pursue the truth. An obsessive, maladaptive desire to pursue the truth to the point of exhaustion. I get genuinely offended by these positions because I find them just epistemologically, aesthetically, they're injurious to the world. I can't understand how someone could have either that stupidity or that intellectual dishonesty or that moral cowardice, and therefore I attack. And oftentimes, frankly, it becomes difficult because you're filled with anger, right? Because it's difficult to always you're angry. How could Alicia Keys argue for that? Does she know what these women experience? So it's just the dogged pursuit of the truth.
Thank you.
As a Darwinian, how would you account for OPS?
Well, not every phenomenon has an evolutionary explanation, right? Diseases exist. People die of diseases. That doesn't mean that they are adaptive by definition. So there need not, I could probably construct an argument if I had to, but there need not be an evolutionary explanation for why OPS exists, other than the fact that you take a collection of ideologies, you put them together, it creates the fertile brain for this parasite to enter. And so I could offer an explanation without referring to evolutionary principles. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Well, even with it, it's security of being part of that,
Right.
part of that group.
Yeah, true.